So welcome to everyone. This is a mini conference of the UI, the Pierre Werner chair and the Pierre Werner chair holder and the Banco of Spain. So I want to thank first the Banco of Spain for hosting us, except we have to do it in Zoom. Even now, Madrid seems to be the only place that you can go for beers and tapas, but we cannot travel there. So we had to do it Zoom. As you know, we're going to have two parts of this mini conference. The first one, we're going to present, you will present some research papers and research going on the topic. And then we have a break, and there will be the second part, which will be more of a policy-oriented discussion. So, first of all, thanks to all of you to be here. We have an excellent both part one and part two of speakers, discussants, and roundtable participants. So I don't want to waste more time, and I think we should just start going on. In the first part, there will be 20 minutes for each presentation. You're going to have the three presentations, one after the other. And then there will be two discussions of 10 minutes each. You can use the chat facility to ask questions. And if it's specific to a particular presenter or discussion or whoever, just mention this in your question. And then we hope to have some time for general discussion. I will probably collect the questions and pass them to the speakers. So with any further ado, the first speaker is Linda Larsen from the Copenhagen Business School, which is going to present work with Klaus Munk, which is also the same school, on the design and welfare implications of mandatory pension plans. So you can share your screen.
Thank you. And I hope now that everyone can see my screen and my mouth as well, so I can point to the slides. So thank you for the invitation to present this joint work here with Klaus Munk. Both of us is from Copenhagen Business School and is affiliated with Percent and the Danish Finance Institute. So I'm going to present this paper on the design and welfare implication of mandatory pension plans. So many individuals build up insufficient retirement savings. For example, in the US, more than half of adult Americans worry that they will not have enough money for retirement. About half have no access to a workplace retirement saving plan. And on top of that, for example, in a recent working paper by Gomez and co-authors, they show that in a sample of workers with a defined contribution plan, 75% save too little to maintain their standard of living during retirement. On top of that, almost all fail to annuitize their retirement savings. So that is that the individuals risk outliving their wealth. For example, there is a paper from 2012 from Lockwood, who estimates that less than 5% of US households participate in the annuity market. So mandatory pension plans that can reduce the undersaving problem. And in many countries, for example, in the UK or in Denmark, from where I'm at, mandatory pension plans are already working there. In the US, several states are currently introducing or expanding such programs as well, while some economists and politicians push for a universal mandatory retirement saving program. Opponents point to a general aversion against government intervention in personal decision, and in particular that mandatory programs will harm rational individuals which are capable of accumulating sufficient savings on their own. So what we want to investigate in this paper here is, first of all, how does a mandatory pension plan actually affect the welfare of participants? And if we introduce such a plan, what is then the optimal design of a broad mandatory pension plan? So what is the contribution rates? Which fraction of income should each individual pay into the plan? From which age should they start paying into the plan? What should the investment profile be of the pension fund? So what is the optimal stock bond mix? And how should the payout profile be? We study all of these questions in a very rich life cycle model, which we calibrate to the US data. So our model includes both uncertain labor income, mortality risk, social security benefits, and possible out-of-pocket medical costs during retirement. Well, of course, if all individuals behaved in a rational way, then there was no need for mandatory pension plans. So the welfare effects depends a lot on the preference and the sophistication of our investors. Evidence points to the fact that quite a large proportion of individuals procrastinates on their savings. So that is that they simply save less than she or he would like to. For example, there is a paper by João and co-authors from 2002, where they, based on a survey, ask employees in big US companies about their savings. And 68% of them say themselves that they are saving too little. 24% say that they plan to increase savings during the next 2 months, but only 3% of them actually do it. So obvious, the mandatory plans can improve the welfare of this type of irrational individuals, but it's harder to improve the welfare of rational individuals at the same time. But remember that these rational individuals, they are rational, they know what they should do in an optimal way. So they could actually just go in and adjust their private savings and investment decision if they were forced also to participate in this mandatory plan. On top of that, there will be a lower return taxation on the pension savings than private savings, which is also positive for the rational investors. And they will also face better annuitization terms. So what we show in this paper here is that a well-designed plan mitigates the undersaving problem and can improve the welfare of most rational individuals as well. Okay. In particular, based on our calculation on the welfare gains for a range of individuals, we find a default pension plan, which is a plan that gives us the highest average gain of the considered participant. And this plan here consists of a 10% contribution rate that you have to pay into the pension fund from age 30 to retirement. The savings are invested, follows a glide path strategy with 90% invested in stocks until 25 years before retirement, and then slopes to 30% 10 years after retirement, and then stays there. The payouts follows a lifelong annuity, and you are automatically enrolled in this annuity when you hit retirement age. And the returns on the pension savings are tax exempt. Such a default, or this default plan here, implies an average gain of $210,000 in present value terms for the considered participants. The gain, of course, ranges from which type of individuals we look at. The procrastinators' gains are, of course, the highest, and these range from 100,000 to 700,000 approximately, depending on the level of risk aversion. Whereas the rational gains, that ranges from a loss of approximately 30,000 to a gain of 37,000. So it actually is the case, as I've noted here, that some rational investors will face a loss if we introduce this mandatory pension plan. However, by adding few realistic options to this default plan up here, we can actually make all rational participants gain from the mandatory pension plan. One of the things is that we should allow them to choose another investment plan than this glide path strategy stated up here. And they should be also be allowed to have a lower solidarity factor, a factor that I will explain in a few slides. If we allow for these two options here, the loss will be reduced to 3,000. And if we are then on top of that also allow for a pay up option where the participants are allowed to pay out a fraction of the pension account before retirement of up to 5%, then we can transform this loss into a gain, even for the most critical rational investors. Okay, so I will now take you through this life cycle model. I'll try not to be too technical, and it's, as I said, it's a very rich model, so I cannot go down in all the small details here. So, but I just give you an overview. So first of all, the timing. So we use a model here with annual steps for each of the decision problems, right? So at each year, the investors have to decide their consumption and their investment strategy. When they enter into a model, they have the age of 25. When they turn 67, they retire. And you may live until the age of 100. There is the possibility that you can die from the age of 25 and up to 100, but you may have the possibility to live all the way up to the age of 100, but then you will for sure die. Income is taxed at 30%, and we calibrate our models to match the median 25-year-old US worker. So that is, he will start out with an initial income of 40,000 per year. During his working life, this income here will have a normal growth with an expected growth hump shape in age, which is standard in these life cycle models. At retirement, his income dropped to 45% of this pre-retirement income. So this, you can think about that. Then when he retires, he will start receiving Social Security benefits, and with a drop of these of these 45%, this corresponds to an after-tax annual Social Security benefit of approximately $17,000. In retirement, the investors face the risk of out-of-pocket medical costs, which will then reduce the income further. Then we have the pension fund, where the individuals has to pay in a fraction alpha of their pre-tax income. They will be forced to pay in from a certain age and until retirement. The fund will then invest these savings using an age-dependent fraction, W, which would be invested in stocks, and the rest will be invested in bonds. Important thing here is that the returns are tax exempt. The pension savings, they are illiquid, so they cannot be paid out prematurely. When you retire, your savings will be transformed into an annuity, a lifelong annuity, where you will get a constant payout in expectation. The payouts are taxed as income. And then we explore these different pension fund designs. And one aspect is that what happens to the balance of the pension account upon death. And this is where this solidarity factor I here comes in. So I here denotes the fraction of the balance upon death that is distributed to the surviving fund members. And then the remaining balance will then be paid out to the heirs of the deceased members. Okay. So if you choose I equals 1, then the plan is fully solidary. So that is the balance of the deceased fund members is distributed to the surviving members. If we choose I equals 0, then the plan is personal, and the plan is simply isolated from the accountants of other members. And if you die, then the rest of the fund will be paid out to your heirs. Okay. The cost of this, or why should we then take a fully solidary plan. The reason to choose that is that up here, of course, the payouts will be higher, right? So the payouts that you can receive in expectation, that will be higher compared to what you will have if you make the plan personal. Okay. The assets that we can invest in, so both the pension fund and the individuals can invest in a risk-free asset with a constant rate of return of real return of 1%. And you can invest in the stock market with normal returns, has a risk premium of 4% and volatility of 16%. Again, standard parameters in the literature. The private returns on your investments, they are taxed by 20%. And we assume that the initial private wealth is equal to 5,000, again, in line with data. We assume that our investors' preferences are described by an Epstein-Sim utility. So they want to maximize their expected utility by choosing an optimal consumption strategy and investment, so their private stock investment, so they can invest some of their private wealth in the stock themselves, right? So that we denote by pi. So that wants to maximize their utility, so they utility from their consumption and from future utility, which of course depend on if future utility, if you're still alive, or bequest if you end up dying. Okay. Again, we use very standard parameters, at least in this presentation. We of course vary them in the paper. So we assume that the risk aversion is equal to 4. The elasticity of intertemporal substitution is equal to 1/4. Our subjective time preference rate is equal to 0.96. And psi here, which measures the strength of our bequest motive, you can see it enters up here, is set equal to 2. And this is quite standard variables in the literature, which we are going to use as our base case here. A key element in our analysis is to compare the utility of welfare that an individual can generate on the different design of these mandatory pension plans here. But of course, under the same assumption of income and initial wealth and so on. So we measure this by a fraction of additional lifetime income and initial wealth that the individual would need to receive under the alternative design to get the same lifetime utility. So if we have a 1% difference in utility, that corresponds to 1% of income and wealth. So if we want to have some more amounts on that to have a feeling is 1% is that big or low gain. So if we calculate the present value of the after-tax income of the income stream, that is approximately equal to 1.5 million. So a 1% welfare gain, that will correspond to approximately $15,000, just so you have an idea about the gains that I will talk about.
5 minutes, eh?
Thank you. So time goes very fast here, so I will not go into the details about the solution method here. It's we use backward dynamic programming, a huge program, and use some small tricks there to calculate the utility, from which we then can calculate welfare gain and losses relative to cases without mandatory pension plans. So first, we need a benchmark here. So that will be the case where we don't have a mandatory pension plan, but the investors will have access to an annuity. So we have that in the benchmark case with the chosen parameters. We will, down here in this figure here, I have the life cycle pattern of the consumption profiles of my rational investor and my procrastinator. So blue down here, that's for the rational. The orange figures down here is for the procrastinators. And if we first look at the rational investor, we get this consumption, expected consumption pattern here that has this hump shape, which is produced by these life cycle models where consumption peaks here around retirement. If I allow for an annuity, then the rational investor will annuitize 75.2% of wealth at retirement. And we can see that implies that he can, if we look at the dashed line down here, he can increase his consumption over life. Where if he don't have the annuity, he faces the risk of outliving his wealth, right? So he cannot consume as much here in the beginning, since he then need to be sure that he have enough wealth until time of his death. Then we have the procrastinators. So the ones that simply wants to consume too much too early due to the lack of self-control. We model this by convenience simply by assuming that they apply a subjective time preference rate lower than what we have in our base case. So they apply 0.85 when they determine their consumption and private stock weight. I don't have time to come into why this is, we think it's a proper way to do it, but you would just have to believe me that that is, I'll take it as given, okay? And what we can see, if our individuals apply this, then they will have this orange consumption part over here. So we can see they consume way too much here in the beginning of their life. And that implies that they cannot consume much in retirement. So they have simply saved up too little, as you can also see over here at the wealth, during their working lives because they consume too much early. So we can see that the bills of saving at retirement of only 185,000 compared to 520,000 as the rational investor over here. So a mandatory pension plan can potentially, or hopefully, reduce this loss we face here by bringing this life cycle pattern closer to the one that we have over here, right? So we want to bring the orange curve up to the blue curves. I don't have time to take you through this, but back on the envelope calculations, there we argue that approximately 2/3 of the population is procrastinators. So we don't think it's completely strange to see how these mandatory pension plans can actually change the welfare being of such a big part of the population. Okay, so but let us now see if we can design a mandatory pension plan that can help procrastinators reduce this welfare loss here. So to streamline the analysis, we focus on relatively simply plan designs. So the broad pension plans should cover heterogeneous individuals and stipulates a default choice of a contribution rate, alpha, and the starting age. I have not shown the optimal saving rate in the no pension case, but there you will see that the optimal saving rate is around 10–15%. We can, of course, not just directly translate this into a preferred contribution rate for the pension plan, since the pension savings are illiquid, but at least that could give us a hint that that is the range where we should be. And also note that the pension savings that gives us this tax benefit, so maybe will not make the rational investor that angry if we take a contribution rate around these 10%. We check for different investment policies to see if we see which one gives us the higher welfare gain. The first one is 50% invested in stocks all life. So this is the pension fund, right, that follow one of these. Investment strategy 2 is where we have a stock weight at HT is 120 minus the 8. So that is the 120 minus 8 strategy that is popular amongst some financial advisors. Then we have this IP tree here, which is the stock weight is 90% until 25 years before retirement, and then slopes to 30% 10 years after retirement, and then stays there. This emulates Vanguard's target data funds. Then we have a more aggressive one where we have 100% until the age 20 years before retirement and slopes down to 50. And then stays there. This resembles the life cycle pattern of the optimal stock weight for the rational investor in the no pension case. And finally, we have where we simply have 100% stocks all life. I will say that the two plans that are interesting that will be optimal in all cases is either plan 3 or 5 down here. So most cases, plan 3 up here turns out to be the optimal plan. And then finally, we have the solidarity factor here, where we consider values in the multiples of 0.10 to see which one is the optimal one. Okay.
You should write pineapple, okay?
Yes. What we show is that here, what I have here is the welfare gains in percent, where we consider the investor with a risk aversion of 4 and an ICE of 1 a quarter. What you can see down here, and you can probably have to go and check the paper as well, is that we simply test for different contribution rates. That is what we have down here, starting from different ages. And what we get is that if you look at what is the best investment plan and what is the optimal solidarity factor, is that actually most of them will have 100% solidarity factor. So completely solidary annuity, and they would prefer investment plan 3. And if we then calculate the average gain for all these different participants that we look at for different risk aversions, we can go down here and see that where we gain the most, that is when we start paying in from the age of 30. So if we compare over here, the age of 30 and pay in 10%. So our contribution rate is 10%. That is where we will have the highest welfare gain. So in total, based on this, we determine that our default plan is 10%, a contribution rate of 10% starting from the age of 30, and we should use investment strategy 3 and a solidarity factor of 100%. And we can see that procrastinators benefit a lot from this plan here. It corresponds to 445,000 in present value terms for this gamma equals 4 investor. If we increase the risk aversion, everyone will still be very happy. If we lower the risk aversion, procrastinators will still be happy. However, they would prefer a more aggressive investment plan. So they would prefer investment plan 5 with 100% invested in stocks. But the rational individuals will face a loss of 2%, so they will not be too happy. But as I said in the introduction, when introducing my main results, we can add options such that also the rational investor will be happy. So this is just to show that now the orange and the blue lines, they merge and we get the procrastinator closer to behave as rational investors. So since my time is up, I have to simply stop here and say that we show that with a well-designed mandatory pension plan, we can mitigate both under-saving problems and also the fact that too few investors actually annuitize their savings when facing retirement age. So with that,
thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Let's move on and the timing. Ofer Setty will present the next paper. Is joined with Catherine Schlavman and Rowan Betzman. An optimal defined contribution pension plans, one size does not fit all. Ofer, your 20 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. This is joint work with Catherine Schlavman from Copenhagen Business School and Werner from Stockholm University. Our work is motivated by the worldwide trend of pension reforms, from defined benefits to defined contribution. Defined contribution plans are going to be the focus of this paper, and we note that those have flexible equity share options. So we see rules such as 100 minus age that allow fund managers to decide or to condition the equity share on the age. However, contribution rates seem to be quite rigid, and they are basically a constant factor or a fraction of current earnings for everyone. And this is interesting, we think, because investors do differ in many ways, but for our context, there are two especially important dimensions. The first is their ability to smooth consumption. So if we compare young investors to old investors, then we understand that young investors have a harder time since they have less wealth to smooth this consumption and to prepare themselves for income shocks. The other point about how investors differ, and this is actually a consequence of the current regime or design, is that when you look at replacement rates, what is the fraction of previous earnings that the annuities provide out of the defined contribution plans, you see a lot of dispersion. And motivated by those two observations of differences for investors, we ask how to set a flexible contribution rate, taking into account investors' characteristics. To do this, we build an incomplete markets life cycle portfolio choice model that has a lot of heterogeneity in age, income, wealth, and participation. Some of it is endogenous and some of it is exogenous. Investors have consumption saving decisions and financial decisions such as participation and the equity share for the financial wealth. We then use the model first to study the effect of mandatory defined contribution on investors. How does the burden of a mandated plan is translated into the decisions and eventually their consumption and welfare? Then we consider flexible contribution rate rules. Now, this paper is not about whether people should save more or less in mandated savings than they actually do. And therefore, in all the simulations we have, we maintain the average replacement rate out of the DC as in the current design. Our main result is a simple rule for contribution rates that depends on two variables. The first is age. We find that the rule allows or dictates that older investors should contribute relatively more than young investors. The second variable that we condition on in this rule is the defined contribution balance to income. So for every investor at every point in life, we calculate how much she has already accumulated in the account, and we divide that by her income. This is a good predictor for what the replacement rate is going to be. And this allows us to correct for too high or too low replacement rates. This optimal design achieves the following two goals. First, it decreases the dispersion of replacement rates. And second, it allows investors to better smooth consumption over the life cycle, which translates into young investors having higher consumption than they currently have. This plan delivers a welfare gain of 3.3% and it's Pareto improving. The message of our paper is that a simple design of flexible contribution rates may provide large welfare gains. I'm going to skip the literature for the sake of time and go to the main features of our model. We have a life cycle model with incomplete markets. We use Epstein's preferences. Investors have two phases in life, The first one starts at age 25 and lasts for 40 periods. During that time, they have mandatory deposits into the notional pension, which represents the first pillar of pension savings, and a defined contribution account, which, as I said, is the focus of this paper and represents the second pillar of pension savings. Investors face two sources of risk, which is going to create some of the heterogeneity that is very important for the outcome of this paper: labor income risk and stock return shocks. So those two things are going to affect how much you have in the account and what is this level refers to, which is the income. And eventually it's going to affect how big or how large or how low the replacement rate is going to be for each individual. The second phase, retirement, starts at 65 and lasts for 35 periods. And during that time, investors receive annuities from the two mandatory saving accounts. Investors make the following decisions. First, consumption saving decisions with respect to a liquid financial wealth account that is separate from the DC, and they can use it whenever they want. And two financial decisions, participation in the stock market and portfolio choice between stock market equity and risk-free bond. We calibrate the model to Sweden's current design of defined contribution, which is 6.5% contribution rate for everyone. Now, as I said earlier, we're going to use this model first to understand what are the implications of the current regime. And there are two very interesting implications that we are going to try to work with when we use the flexible rules. So first, on the left, when you look at this figure, you can see on the horizontal axis, we have age, starting at 25 up to 65. On the vertical axis, we have the average consumption over the life cycle. This is noted in 10,000 Swedish kronas, which is very roughly thousands of dollars. The blue shows the baseline average consumption. This is all in the current regime. We're not, or current design. We're not putting yet the optimal design, which comes after that. So the blue shows you the regular hump-shaped consumption profile. But then we can use the model to see what the counterfactual is if there wasn't any mandatory defined contribution system. And what you can see in the red line is that there is still a hump shape, but it's not as stark as the blue one. In other words, there is a limited ability in the current regime for investors to smooth consumption over time. Young investors actually want to borrow, not so much save, as their income is lower and they have future shocks. So they would prefer not to save when they're young, not to save for an illiquid account that only comes later, that can only be used later. Moving to the other implication on the right, we see that there is a large dispersion in replacement rates across investors. Again, the replacement rate is how much I am going to get out of the defined contribution account relative to my income at age 65. The mean is 0.26. So there are other sources as the notional account that are going to contribute to my annuities, but specifically from the DC, on average, people get 26%. But as you can see, this is accompanied by a very large dispersion of a standard deviation of 11 percentage points. And as you can see from the percentiles 99 and 1, people are getting very different replacement rates. Now, it's important at this point to understand why. So the replacement rate is affected by two things: how much I have in my account and what is my income. The first thing, how much people have in their account, is affected not only by how much they contribute, but also by stock market shocks, right? So positive stock market shocks are going to increase the balance and therefore increase the replacement rates. The other thing is the income that people have. And this is a model that realistically features income shocks. So if an investor has an income that is decreasing, then again, that means that the replacement rate is going to be high, right? So what you see here is a result of different combinations of income shocks and stock market shocks that are calibrated or parameterized to be realistic. So those two implications are what we are after when we're going to design the flexible contribution rates. In particular, we have a dual goal. The first is to allow a better consumption smoothing over the life cycle, again, allowing investors to consume more when they are young. And the second is to reduce their replacement rate dispersion. So going back to this slide, I'm going to follow this 0.11 standard deviation in looking at different new designs for the contribution rates. So the instruments we're going to use are two. First, age, and the second is the DC balance to income ratio. How much people already accumulated in the account relative to their income. We can also set this formally. This lambda IT is the contribution rate. So right now in Sweden, this is 6.5% regardless of how old people are, how much they already have, and so on. What we propose here, or what we allow in this rule, is that it's going to depend on a constant rate. So beta 0 is what currently is in Sweden, but also on the age in a linear way. So beta 1 times t, where t goes from 25 to 64. And then the last element, beta 2 coefficient, multiplies this term here. This term is b over y. B is the balance of the account, y is income. So b over y is the DC balance to income ratio, which is the variable of interest for us. And we are going to look at deviations from the specific level of the DC balance to income of each person relative to the cohort. So that's the b over y bar that you have here at on the term. Okay, so using that rule, we can now look separately at rules that only allow to condition on age, only those that condition on DC balance to income ratio, and rules that allow to condition on both. So let's look at what we get. The best age-dependent design, lambda IT equals to minus 0.25 plus 0.007 times age, going from 25 to 64. We put a lower bound of 0, of course, for the contribution rate, and an upper bound of 50%. So there are no negative or very high contribution rates. The implication of that rule is that people save nothing until they're 35, and then they gradually start saving 10% at 50 and 21 at 65, 21% at 65. Again, this rule guarantees that the average replacement rate out of the DC is going to be the same as in the current design, right? It's just when, in this specific design, what changes is when people save. And now the standard deviation of the DC replacement rate that we're using as a yardstick is going down from 0.11 to 0.07. So starting late really helps because some of the shocks have already been realized in income. Right, moving now to the second rule, to the second type of rule, only conditioning on the balanced income ratio. So again, we're looking at the ratio of B over Y, of how much each individual has in the account relative to his Y, and taking that term relative to the average of the cohort. And we see that we get a coefficient of 1.75. Now here, the average contribution rate for everyone is the same as the baseline. But when you look within a cohort, you would see a large dispersion in contribution rates And the role is to take into account how much people have already accumulated. If some people accumulated a lot, then their contribution rate is decreased, and vice versa. Okay, so here we're going to get a standard deviation of this replacement rate somewhat lower than the age, from 0.11 to 0.06. And finally, when we allow for both coefficients on time and on deviations from the cohorts balanced to DC balance to income ratio, we get the following rule, right? So a negative constant plus 0.003 times t. If you compare it to the 0.007, what that means is that the increase with age is much more gradual, right? So here people start contributing immediately, and the average contribution rate increases to 13% until 65. Of course, there are still variation within each cohort, as in the balanced income ratio design, right? And here we are, this allows us to take the standard deviation from 0.11 to 0.04. So those are the three designs. Of course, at this point, what we want to know is, why does that matter? Okay, so we already see that there is a decrease in the dispersion of the replacement rate, which looks like a good idea. But now we can look at the welfare implications of that. And in order to do that, we're going to look at a set of figures that, that is based on this one. So let me explain what we have here. On the horizontal axis, we have the replacement rate. So Sweden's average replacement rate out of the DC is 26%. So it's that point right here. This is the current baseline design of Sweden. And by construction, the welfare gain of that, because this is the reference point, is 0. So this is that point over here. Then we can think about the consequences of shutting down the DC completely. So instead of mandating a saving rate of 6.5%, so what would happen if nobody has to save anything in defined contribution? Since investors are rational, they prefer that because they can mimic the saving of the defined contribution. And what you can see here is that we get to this point over here, which is marked as no DC, and it's associated with a 4.9% welfare gain. So this 4.9% is the potential gain that we can do by tuning or fine-tuning the current system. But our goal would be to remain at an average replacement rate of 26% as the baseline design. So now I'm going to work.
We're on 3 minutes. It's okay.
All right, perfect. So when we allow for the age-dependent policy, we already get a 2.1%. So this was associated with decreasing the standard deviation from 0.11 to 0.07. Oh, those points I didn't mention in the middle. Those points are respectively 20, 40, 60, and 80% of the current saving rate in Sweden. So you can see also what would be the implication of reducing the saving rate, and the gain is about, in relative terms, about the same. Now we're going to add only the balance to income ratio by itself. Now you get the blue point. Now we get a welfare gain of 2.7% relative to the 4.9% potential that we have here. And finally, there's a question of whether those two things substitute or complement each other. And it turns out that there is an added value of using both instruments. So again, the variables that are of importance is how old is the person, and the second thing is how much he has in her account relative to her income. And this is a Pareto gain. So everyone ex ante is happy about using that rule over here. Let me conclude. Current DC designs are rigid, and they have two implications. There is a large replacement rate dispersion, and there is low ability to smooth consumption over the life cycle. We propose a relatively simple design of contribution rates that depend on age and on the DC balance to income ratio. Our proposal provides a welfare gain of 3.3% out of a potential of 4.9% and maintains the average replacement rate of about 26%.
Speaker before the discussions is João Brogueira de Sousa, and he's going to present the joint work with Julián Díaz Sevilla and myself on the Austrian backpack as an alternative to the Spanish pay-as-you-go pension system. João?
Hi, thanks. Do you see my screen?
Yes, you have 20 minutes, okay?
Thank you. Okay. So I'll be talking about an alternative to the Spanish, but not only the Spanish, to any pay-as-you-go pension system that we call the Austrian backpack. Okay, so the main reason why we are talking about an alternative is because of the pressure that these systems are currently subject to. And this is coming from what's forecasted for the evolution of the age distribution in the population. Let me show you here this plot. So at the time I'm 60 over here, if I make it there, the number of people older than me, older than 65, will be double relative to today's ratio when we compare the population over 65 to what we usually think of as the working age population. And that's it's quite extreme here in this set of countries for Spain, but it's a common trend in all countries. The US is here a bit lower, but common to other European countries, okay? And since these pension systems that are out there today in these countries, the way they work is that they are transfers from workers to retirees. So current pensions are funded by taxing workers. And this ratio is evolving as we just saw. This implies a huge pressure on the current systems, okay? This has been studied before. The alternative that we are studying and that I'll be talking about is a funded system that has not been studied as an alternative to a pay-as-you-go pension system, and this is the Austrian backpack, okay? Let me tell you what this is. So this is an employment fund, a worker's backpack. So it's owned by the worker. It's an individual backpack, and it's transferable across jobs, and it accumulates with a contribution rate that we call the backpack tax. So it's a basic payroll tax, and it accumulates while working. It's funded, so it earns and it's capitalized in the market. It earns a market interest rate. And a particular feature here is that it can be used, meaning it can be tapped during unemployment and at retirement. So it's flexible in this dimension on when it can be used by the worker. Okay, so at retirement, it converts into an annuity payment, as we saw before in other papers, and it's not taxed as income. And we take the name from the Austrian reform in 2003, where a similar system was introduced, but to substitute severance payments. So it was a smaller BP, and there were no links to retirement pensions. Okay, so we will study it in this context of pension reform in Spain, and we'll look at it as a complement to unemployment insurance and a substitute to the current pension system. Okay, the questions we are after So how does a BP economy compare with a pay-as-you-go economy in the long run? So after this demographic transition has occurred, and how does it compare to other pension systems, private savings or funded systems, funded pension funds? And then also an important question: how can the transition be implemented from the current pay-as-you-go system to a BP, to a funded system, and whether or not it's possible to design a transition that is Pareto improving, meaning that there are no costs for none of the generations that will be born from now until this system is in full place. Okay, so how do we do it? So we develop a model with an overlapping generations model. So there's a life cycle component, there's age, there's income risk, there's labor market risk and labor market decisions. So agents can be employed, unemployed, inactive if they are not searching for a job, or retired. All these are so there is an employment risk, and then there is job search and retirement decisions that are endogenous. Okay. There are optimal consumption and savings decision over time, labor supply and job search, as I said, and the retirement decision. So what we do, we take this model, we solve the steady state equilibrium, and initially we calibrated to Spain in 2018. So with current policies and current demographics. Then we changed the age distribution according to what's forecasted today to what it will be, in this case, in Spain in 50 years. And we solved 3 alternative scenarios. One, we let the pension system as it is today, we let it in place. And then an alternative one, the main one we focus on, a scenario in which there is no pay-as-you-go pensions, but instead a BP system, a backpack system. Okay, and then we also compare that to other funded systems like a standard pension fund and full private savings economy. Okay, and then as I said, after we solve for these 2 steady states, we also look at the transition path and how to implement the BP system along the transition. So before we run out of time, let me tell you about the main findings. So how does a BP economy compare with a pay-as-you-go economy? It's capitalized, so higher capital stock. It's more productive with higher employment, especially at older ages, and output and consumption, and much lower payroll taxes. So we are assuming that in the long run, payroll taxes are whatever they need to be to finance the pensions in the pay-as-you-go system. And so in the BP economy, this translates into much lower taxes. How does it compare to other pension systems? It's similar, the BP economy, but at the individual level, this additional flexibility by the backpack system implies better insurance for the different demographic groups, and also higher welfare as a consequence. And then the final question, can we implement a Pareto improving transition from the current pay-as-you-go system to a BP economy? This is work in process, so it's what we are working on now. So we are looking at debt finance transitions in low interest rate environments. And we have 2 options, fast and slow. In the fast, there are large welfare gains in the long run, as I mentioned before, and non-negative gains during the transition. That's by construction. I'll explain how we do it later. And lower pension deficits during the transition, meaning lower debt after the transition takes place, compared to the second scenario in which we operate slow transition. So the quantitative exercise I mentioned before, first we take the model, we calibrate to Spanish data. We have the age and education distribution there. These are the main drivers behind the demographic distribution that we have in 2018 and 2068. Then we target the main economic aggregates, wealth and income distribution, and the labor market stocks and flows. And we also take as input the tax policy parameters, unemployment benefits, and the retirement pension rules as they are now. We then change the age distribution to what's forecasted right now for Spain in 50 years. And we solve for the two alternative scenarios. The second one, we need to find the backpack contribution rate. So we search for the backpack rate between 0 and some large number that maximizes average welfare ex ante in the economy. And we find 21% as the welfare maximizing contribution rate. So that's the economy I will show you, okay? So these are the inputs I told you about. I don't know if you can see these numbers. These are the main inputs. So we have the age distribution in 2018 with 24% of the population older than 65. And then we have in 2068, 36%. Okay, and then on the left panel, we have the survival probabilities that are fed into the model that are consistent with the distributions by age we see on the right. Okay, so these are the two economies in the long run, the main aggregates. The first thing I want to look at is the capital stock, the capital output ratio, because this backpack is a saving device, a mandatory saving device. And so what we find is that even though private savings actually go down, the total capital stock in the economy is larger. We are assuming here a closed economy, so all private savings and backpack savings account for the capital stock, the productive capital. That's what we see highlighted here. And then this translates into a change in prices, again, by this closed economy assumption. The interest rate goes down substantially and the wage rate goes up. This is one of the reasons, apart from the changes in the pension system, that employment goes up and retirement, so the share of retirees goes down significantly. So taxes are much lower, wage rate is higher, so more people work, even though on average they work slightly less of their time. And all these large changes translate into changes in the government budget. So the payroll tax that we saw in 2058, that was 50%, is less than 3% in the backpack economy. And that's mainly because of the pension payments. You see highlighted here the social security budget we have in the model. So this is pension payments and unemployment benefits. In the BP economy, pension payments are 0, and accordingly, payroll tax collections go from 24% to just 1%, which is whatever is necessary to cover unemployment benefits. Okay. As you can expect, this translates into huge welfare gains. So this is 3 different scenarios: a private savings economy in which we just eliminate the pension system, then a pension fund, which is a standard defined contribution pension fund that pays an annuity payment at retirement, and our backpack system. These are all much higher welfare compared to the pay-as-you-go economy. This is the order of magnitude of the decrease in payroll taxes. And And the bottom table shows the change in welfare in the backpack economy and in the pension fund economy relative to the private savings economy. So these are the long run gains. So we ask ex ante if someone at age 20 would prefer to enter the labor market in the pay-as-you-go economy or in any other of the alternative systems. And next, we want to look at the transition. So how do we go from the current steady state in 2028 to the final steady state after this demographic transition took place? Okay, so this is again the dependency ratio that comes from the forecasted evolution of the age distribution in Spain again. And if we let the model run, assuming the pay-as-you-go system is in place, this is the payroll tax rate that's necessary to finance pensions. Okay, so we go from 25% in 2020 to all the way to 51, as I showed you before. And so this is the status quo scenario, and now we are looking at a transition with the same dependency ratios in the background, but an alternative pension policy. Okay, so we looked at, so far we looked at two alternatives. A slow one, we call it slow, because only the newcomers entering the economy in 2019 and onwards enter the BP system, and all existing workers and retirees stay in the BP, in the pay-as-you-go system. Okay. If we run this transition, what we find is that there are large pension deficits. So if we assume that all these pension deficits are financed with debt at zero interest, after the transition takes place, we have a stock of debt which is roughly seven times GDP, and this is because all the 2009 pension claims and payments, so for all workers and retirees, are unfunded by the new cohorts that enter the economy and enter into the BP system. Alternatively, if we don't have pension deficits, then there are huge welfare costs for the newcomers, because they enter the BP system with a high contribution rate of 21%, and also a high payroll tax to fund all existing and future pensions. Okay, so this is the slow. We then solve the fast version of this. The fast one is that we move all newcomers and current workers to the BP system in 2019 and onwards. So the newcomers enter with zero claims to these backpack payments, and the current workers receive backpack claims such that they weakly prefer the BP transition to the status quo. Okay, and then all these backpack claims, these claims on future pension payments, are again funded with debt. Again, for now we assume zero interest debt, and only the retirees, people that were already retired in 2019 and onwards, keep their pension payments, and again these pension payments are financed through debt. And the idea here is to borrow along the transition against these large gains in the long run. Okay, so if we run this alternative fast scenario, the debt that is needed to fund the initial BP claims, so for workers in 2019 and onwards, and current pensions, the debt accumulated at the end of the transition is much lower than the slow transition. It's 2 times GDP, and by construction, this is Pareto improving, because we We are just endowing current workers with backpack claims such that they are not worse off. Okay, so this is the evolution of the payroll tax rate. In blue is the first status quo scenario I showed you before, where we go from 21% to 51%. And in red, the BP transition, in which the payroll tax goes down just enough to cover unemployment benefits, and the backpack tax rate jumps to 21%. It's not shown here. And this is the public debt path, which is building at zero interest to 2 times GDP. So to finish on time, our conclusions and work in progress. So we saw that replacing pay-as-you-go pensions with a funded system like the Austrian backpack in Spain has important welfare gains, capitalizes the economy and diminishes tax distortions. This is not a bullet point, but just a note. This is, as we saw, the demographic transition in Spain is extreme, but it's not an exception. So other countries, particularly in Europe, face the same transition. We show that we can implement a smooth transition to a BP economy without high costs on households that are alive during the reform. And what we are doing right now, I mean, obviously we have to account for different scenarios for the cost of debt, for economic growth that we abstract from, and also from labor and capital markets. So all the results I showed were under the closed economy assumption for Spain, and that's one of the things we are working on. Okay.
Thank you, João. And let's move fast to the discussants, because otherwise we'll run out of time. The first one is Alexander Michaelides from Imperial College Business School.
Thanks, Ramon. Let me share my my screen.
Meanwhile, as you might see, there is a lot of question and answers being answered also in the chat and in the Q&A. So go on.
Okay, so my task is to discuss the two papers, these two papers primarily, in 10 minutes. So as you can understand, it's clear that there's a lot of work behind both papers. Let me see why this is. Okay, so the two. So basically, there's two partial equilibrium life cycle models with a kind of an exogenous equity premium in the stock market. And then there's one general equilibrium life cycle model that we just heard with one asset. And the unifying theme of the three papers is essentially how to fund retirement or how to prevent disasters. So the previous paper reminded me very much of the discussion happening right now in the UK about the university superannuation system, where employers, the universities, are being asked to go from 30 to 50% contributions to preserve the benefits in the future by the regulator. And now the focus here in more the partial equilibrium papers is the how to design this second occupational defined contribution social security pillar. And one unifying theme of these two papers is to deal with financial literacy concerns and the power of default inertia, but they do it in different ways. Now, one thing I should say is, like, this literature is a bit strange. Like, these two papers would fall under household finance in the finance literature because they're kind of life cycle models. Whereas if you look at the general equilibrium, a lot of the questions in the chat were about general equilibrium, then suddenly you become a macro finance model. So that's kind of generates some issues when you're trying to figure out where the papers fit. But let's focus on the partial equilibrium side. So the first paper by Schlafman, Setty, and Westman is calibrated to Swedish data. Contrary to the other paper, it's not going to have any quote-unquote irrationality or, for a lack of a better name, behavioral procrastinators, let's say. Instead, they're going to use random participation costs in a kind of a more quote-unquote standard life cycle model, and then emphasize the 3 different accounts that you use to save for retirement. There's a liquid account that you can access. There's a pension account that evolves as a with a risk-free rate, and the second pillar where you can, which is a defined contribution account, where you can have some endogenous asset allocation as well. And the critical thing is that this is also illiquid. So that's the kind of the main reform is to try to deal with that illiquidity. Now, the random participation costs are to kind of get limited or flat life cycle participation. And you can think of them as proxies for limited financial literacy that Lusardi and Mitchell have emphasized quite a bit in this literature in the last 10, 15 years. And there's a lot of reforms on this issue in many countries to address it. Or you can think of the power of defaults or inertia. So that's kind of the modeling framework to get to fit participation. And then once you kind of build the model, you calibrate the model to match the data, you can focus on figuring out what happens to the endogenous outcomes. And then the main counterfactual is the design on the share of saving invested in the defined contribution account, which is this lambda IT. And T here is age, is not, there's no time varying expected returns or anything here. It's IID returns. So this T is basically age. And it's right now there's it is indeed actually constant in Sweden. Based on that framework, you can try to have a model to match the data, and then you can do counterfactors to figure out whether there is any benefit of to the individual if you move this lambda around. And the intuition, the message is that a constant lambda throughout the life cycle is a bad idea because essentially of that illiquid nature of that DC account. So, and what works better or best is a contribution that is 0 until age 36, and then you kind of increase it. If you only allowed it to depend on age, you kind of gradually increase it as you're kind of mimicking your life cycle labor income profile by 70 basis points or 70 percentage points every year. So a bit less than 1% every year. And then you can also condition it on accumulated wealth as well, increasing the contributions when you're unlucky and you get something below the mean, or do the opposite if you are above the mean. So that's kind of the main message, and that's kind of a nice message. I should emphasize this is kind of a nice idea, I think, to have it like that. So again, it's a rational model, and you match the data, then you do your counterfactuals, you have this message. Now go to the next paper. So this is kind of really, I mean, I'm not doing justice to the complexities of either paper. So I hope the authors forgive me, but they are both very well executed papers with a lot of details about how this is done. Now, in the second paper by Larsen and Monk, again, it's an issue of designing the mandatory pension plans in a life cycle model. And the main result is that you should start contributing later in your life cycle. And then you should, they emphasize this glide path strategy, which is kind of the what's known as target date funds or life cycle funds in the industry, basically, which was alluded to in the presentation earlier, the Vanguard funds. Now, the interesting angle of this paper is that instead of looking at these participation costs to generate the data, they take as given that people are different in an economy, and how are they different? So There's heterogeneity in preferences, but then there's also heterogeneity in kind of the degree of financial sophistication or rationality, and that's put explicitly into the model rather than using participation cost, which was the route taken in the previous paper. So now you're going to have rational people, which is, you can think of the previous paper as the rational people, but then instead of having the participation cost to get to match the data, you're going to have stock avoiders who really, and we know that in many countries there's a low trust that prevents many people from being convinced to participate in the stock market because they don't want to give their money to financial advisors to manage for various reasons, sometimes having to do with corporate scandals in an economy. And then you have procrastinators who are more like psychology and economics literature, where you have a lot of a very high discount rate, a very low discount factor when you solve the model, basically. Now you have these three different people, types of people, and then you have three risk aversion coefficients and two elasticities of substitution. You get 27 different types in this economy, basically. So the question is, can you design a system to make them all better off? And you can understand this gets quite complicated very quickly, but that's kind of the bar that would be needed if you're going to try to convince a politician, basically, to put it to the vote, basically. Now, so the message could be loosely interpreted as similar from the two models. Essentially, you start the contributions later. One size does not fit all because of all these heterogeneities that exist essentially in both models. But one difference is that in many of the specifications in the Larsen-Munk paper, there's different things going on. So the one particular implication is that the share of wealth in stocks is 1 over large parts of the life cycle, especially for the rational households. And that, kind of gets you to think that stocks are too good for these guys in this economy. So which is an issue that you might worry about to some extent. So households in the model like the stock market too much, whereas in the other paper that was dealt with this heterogeneous fixed cost and the kind of partial illiquidity. So even though essentially the conclusions in terms of designing this system are similar, the way to get there is different across the two papers, and that's kind of important, at least in a philosophical way, but also in a practical way, in terms of what it means when you are designing these systems and what you want to achieve, especially when you're going to convince somebody, a policymaker, to make such a big change into the system. Now, so that said, I think both papers make interesting points, and I think it is important to have more papers in the design of these pension systems. My fear is that the problem is quite complex, because you have, once you take this heterogeneity at face value, then it's kind of, it's like a can of worms. So in the first paper, takes essentially, and then the question is, how do you do it? So the first paper takes the approach, we're going to build a structural model, we're going to match the data, and then we're going to do the counterfactuals. This is how Sweden operates right now. They have this constant 6.5%, where we can show that because the marginal utility of having more liquidity early on in the life cycle is better, that can, it's kind of similar a bit to the Austrian backpack from the third paper, that can make me better off, and that can increase welfare, basically. The second paper is more agnostic in terms of the structure, and tries to identify robust rules that could be implemented, that could be robust when you have all these huge heterogeneity that exists into the system. So therefore, it doesn't tie you with the correctness of one particular structural model that exists in the economy. So this is kind of a different approach, which is perfectly fine. And there can be a debate on on which one might be preferable, or depending on the situation, both might be useful. So it's useful to think of of ways where conclusions can be made robust to different sources of heterogeneity in the population, which was done in these papers. But one issue that especially is an issue in when you have a currency union or a European Union or different countries or different international arrangements that have to be similar, the heterogeneities across institutional, the institutional heterogeneities across different countries. So for instance, it's important to think about differences across pension systems in the EU, where they have a common regulator. Which heterogeneity is more important, or is it the within country heterogeneity that all these individuals are facing, or the cross country heterogeneity that there's different system details that are different across this country? For example, can you think of a default rule that can be implemented over the whole of the EU or be offered as an option, which is kind of another level of where this could go. Now, at the more individual level, one thing I want to point out is that both papers, and and it's an issue that exists in this literature. This literature is really almost kind of light years ahead of what actually gets discussed in. If you look at the chartered financial analyst exams that we kind of you have to take a look at it, or if you talk to financial advisors, or if you look at the target date funds that Vanguard offers, they have no conditioning on even risk aversion sometimes, and then focusing also on the share of wealth that you should be saving. That's not even discussed actually in this issue. So the question is, I leave it as a question. Why is that the case? Because this is a huge industry, especially in the US. There's a presidential address by, it will come to me later, but where the fact that the US has a big finance sector is because is attributed to having 401ks from the early 80s, basically, relative to other countries. So academics might need to spend more time interacting with these practitioners, and perhaps another question is maybe having all these bells and whistles in the models might be killing your chance of actually providing useful practical advice and recommendations that can be implemented. And now I'm talking about at the individual level. When they have a client that walks into the room, what do they tell them? Which I think that would be, even if you get that right, that could be a very useful contribution to society. So in conclusion, I think it's important to think about these issues and try to use quantitative models to inform both financial advisors and policymakers, and both papers make useful steps in that direction. And I would be interested to hear ways such models can become more mainstream in industry and policymaking, especially in the panel discussion.
Thanks, Alex, for a very insightful discussion.
Yeah.
Ellen?
Okay.
Ellen McGrattan from the University of Minnesota and Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis will discuss.
What do you guys see my slides?
Yes, we see them.
Okay, are they full screen, Ramon?
Yeah, no, not there, full screen, no.
No, hold on then. Sorry, I teach hybrid, so I don't do this that often. Okay.
Now it's fine.
Okay. Thanks a lot. I didn't follow Ramon's rules. I read all 3 papers, and I see a lot of themes. So I want to kind of think about the big picture and relate the papers a little bit and kind of talk to all 3 sets of authors. This is obviously an important issue. I will
thank you even more if you do that, okay?
What?
I said I will thank you even more if you do that.
This is a big issue, so it's good to be talking about it now. But I should say, in the announcement of this group, there was discussion of COVID and tsunamis. I mean, tsunamis, you see the tide go out and you're about to be smashed. It's like COVID. With Social Security, it's like climate change. Everybody knows, bad stuff's happening, but you don't see the tide go out and you don't feel the, smash of the waves on your face. So I really do think, it's an issue that needs to be, talked about a lot, but, again, without the urgency, people tend to not get too worried until it's too late, much like climate change. So I see the big policy change. We've got, populations aging. I'll show you a picture that really shows Spain prominently in trouble. Cost per retiree, at least here in the US, I mean, costs are really going up in terms of healthcare. And I see the current research of the three papers as really thinking about two things, not just reforming the pay-as-you-go system, but also they're bringing in, especially the last one of João, that integrating the old and all age programs. And that's a theme I kind of want to focus on. It's not just about old, it's about all. And how do we integrate transfer programs in general? I think we do a terrible job, both academics and policymakers. So I'd like to think about that. Here's a picture. I took it out of Hannes Malmberg's paper of the population share of over 50. Over 50 is like the new over 29. Everybody's over 50. You can see the US, but look at Spain, the green line. I mean, youch, you guys are really aging like crazy. So that's what we're worried about. And there's, all the other OECD countries. Well, actually, I think there's more than that. Anyway, a bunch of countries in there. You can see it's all heading in north. So what are the main lessons of these three papers? That there's a lot of potential welfare gains out there from reforming these systems. Larsen, I should use first names, Linda talked about mandatory saving for retirement systems. And that's been on the agenda for 3 decades. Ofer talked about greater flexibility in contributions. And really we could think about, just greater flexibility in the design of our systems. And then João talked about having, backpacks or systems where you're taking into account both young and old. I mean, because we need insurance throughout life. So I want to, with these as my background, I want to think about some issues that came up as I read the papers. I'm going to focus on 3. First, and this is mostly, I have Linda in mind, and she talks about the US. I want to point out a really nice study that answers the question, are households saving too little? I hear this all the time. They're saving too little, where you've got procrastinators. So there's an interesting study. Here are the authors at the bottom, and I'm happy to send the paper if you can't find it, because it was actually done by people at the Office of Tax Analysis. And not very many people go over to the Office of Tax Analysis to read publications, but there's some good stuff over there. And this one's a really good one. What they did was they tracked individuals before and after drawing Social Security, because they wanted to know, like, how is it that they have no savings? Or do we have, dead people littered around, the communities when they're old? I mean, what is happening to them? So they looked at different quintiles of incomes and they checked to see incomes before and after. Well, let's talk about the very lowest. That group actually had the highest replacement rate, meaning they had their spendable income was actually higher in post drawing of the Social Security, meaning that there were lots of public assets in store, that not forever, but for the current groups. And I would love to see this study, not just for the US, but also in other countries. And it would be wonderful to see what other transfer programs, and I'll get to that next, but the other transfer programs that are being used, for example, like in the US, if you save too much, then your kids won't get good, what do you call it, packages when going to college. So for all of my siblings saved not a dime, so that when it came time for their children to go to college, when they filled out the FAFSA to show how much money they had, it saved up. They had none. They put it into their houses because they can't touch that. So there's a lot of saving that's going on through the government, and non-saving, purposeful non-saving going on because of other programs. And it would be lovely to see somebody actually do a nice job of kind of looking at different countries and what programs do you get kicked out of if you're saving too much for retirement. So let me, again, I'm going to do the US. I'm very sorry. If I were a good discussant, I would have gotten some for Sweden, Spain, and all that. So I'm going to just be lazy here and talk about at least the US. So João is talking about combining in the Austrian backpack, combining, the UI program, thinking about workers and thinking about retirees, because, you need insurance both in your working life and in your retirement life. If you think about the US government, now this is table 312 for any nerds out there who look at the NEPA accounts. This is take our government benefits. We have a total of 14.5%. A lot of it goes to old age. That's Social Security, Medicare. But the bulk of the next category are low income. They're getting the public assistance. So that's Medicaid, that's supplemental Social Security, things like that. And the UI stuff for the US is teeny weeny. And I suspect, although I couldn't see it in João's numbers, I was like, how could they not have bigger numbers for public assistance? So I have some questions about like why your numbers look so much lower than the US. But there's a huge amount of transfers, and this goes also to Ofer's discussion. There are things being used to smooth out consumption in addition to some of the things that we're talking about in terms of the defined and contributions and defined benefit plans. So I think that all three papers need to bring in the NEPA accounts. I know João has them, but there's something missing in there. And as macroeconomists, I think we should spend a lot less time studying UI, because I think the big action is in Social Security and public assistance. Okay, transitions. I got two papers, one that had no transition and one that had the transition, because they're busily working on that. And I think that's exactly what we have to do, because everybody knows if we look out into the future under a fully funded system, great, because we're going to lower very distortionary taxes. We're going to lower inefficiencies. But how do we get there? We've promised all these people pensions. We can't just pull the rug out. So the whole trick of these papers is, how do you go from where we are now to a Pareto improving path? And that's what João was trying to do. So I'm going to talk about kind of what we learned from thinking about the US, and then I'm going to talk about what they're trying to do now. And I'm going to question it a teeny bit. So how can we do it? For the US case, what we found, and this I'm now thinking about some work I've done with Ed Prescott in the past, we found that it was possible to kind of phase out the payroll taxes kind of ahead of phasing out the transfers. What we needed to do was protect retirees who are not gaining from lower taxes. You're looking across the different groups and saying, okay, how do I weigh each group? We also found some gain in suspending deductibility of benefits, and a lot of gain from flattening labor tax schedules. Well, we did it both temporarily and then permanently. Interestingly, even the very poor people would like the marginal tax rates flattened, because you get a lot of productive gains in the labor market. So that gives more overall resources to society. Now, what João and the team did instead was to focus on using debt financing. Okay, interest rates are low. So everybody in the world, like the US, we're talking about, everybody's talking about it. We're all tempted to take advantage of low interest rates, like as if somebody is going to hand a bunch of money at 0 rates. I mean, the reason it works in the models is, think about the government budget constraint. You have on one side G plus the interest payments, and then on the other side, you have the change in the debt plus the taxes. So the change in the debt is like, G times B. And if you say, well, look, I'm going to assume I barely have to, they set it to 0. I don't have to pay anything. What you're effectively doing is taking a very large number, 7 in one of their simulations and 2 in the other, and multiplying it by a growth rate. So it's like, voila, a Harry Potter magic wand, you get a bunch of resources and no payments. But in reality, and I think people, even policymakers, need to come to grips with this. In reality, there are going to be interest payments. And we're talking about a slow transition. So we're talking about it's going to take decades. Interest rates we're not going to be paying the overnight bank rate that Goldman Sachs pays to hold for one night. That's not what we're going to be paying. So I do think you have to face the unpleasant fiscal arithmetic of it's hard to do this off of debt. And when you do put in the right calibrations, i.e. realistic ones with realistic interest rates, you just can't get a ton out of that part of the budget constraint. You're going to have to rely on keeping average taxes, don't lower average taxes, but lower marginals. You need to take advantage of some inefficiencies in the system. In the US, we have it in abundance. I mean, we have crazy programs, tons of inefficiencies. Spain, I'm just going to guess, you're not, that much more productive or efficient than US. So I think there are gains by modifying the tax schedules. I think it's going to be harder to do it by debt. So let me summarize. Current research of of the 3 papers, totally on the right path. I do think we need to think about integrating programs for the old and the poor. They have the same interest, by the way. And I know that there's always this interest of thinking about workers and UI, but that's not where the money is. I do think we want to be thinking about Pareto improving reforms. That's definitely right on. Transitions are very tricky. And I like more studies of EU. So many studies of the US, it's like once I want to choke. We have all these very data-rich countries, and they're also in trouble in terms of the too many 50-plussers. So it's very nice to see more studies of the EU system. And hopefully I didn't go over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen, again for a wonderful discussion of all the papers. Unfortunately, we are really out of time, but we have been quite a lot of Q&As on the site, so I will propose to follow them up. We'll send them to every of the speakers, and they can follow up afterwards. So we're going to take very short break, 3 minutes break, and then we will resume the parts 2. We are a little late. Thanks, everyone.